Hello. I hope you can hear me and that you can help me see me, and I hope this all works out. But we'll see. Always an adventure. I guess if it doesn't work out now, I'd try again later. So we'll see. Let me make sure if I see anything wrong with my settings, but I don't. Okay, as you're watching this, assuming you're watching this on Friday at 12:30, I should be probably in like Virginia or Maryland on my way to DC. And I wish I was with you. On the way back, I'm probably going to be hitting some of the weather from the hurricane, but what can you do? Okay. So we're going to pick up where we left off last time, talking about political participation. I had just gotten into the topic of social capital. Social capital is a really interesting topic. It's kind of fascinating, and it's sort of ties in with a lot of modern technological changes in the way we live our lives, and it kind of is about the extent we interact with each other, and even in ways that are not overtly explicitly political, and maintaining that those ways of interacting with each other that are not political can have implications for politics. And so it's kind of really interesting. It could be the way we interact with each other politically, but it also can talk about in terms of, as I said last time, just the extent we have trust and mutual respect, empathy and sympathy for each other. And it's the idea that the more time we spend with each other, the more we are able to work with each other. And in those societies where there's a lot of social capital, and it's capital, I'm going to get my water, with with the C, you're building up something that's good. And so we like to see it in a society. And the idea too is that societies that have high levels of social capital work better. And by work better, it means they solve their problems better. They find, or people argue, and they show data that supports the notion that in those societies, children do better. There's lower crime, there's lower other types of things that are undesirable. Like I said, I think Putnam, the guy who's the big proponent of social capital, talks about citizens in states that have high social capital, there's fewer reports of people giving the finger on the highways as they're driving around, and there's all other kind of things that occur. He originally got the idea, I guess, studying Italy, and I guess northern Italy seems to work, from what I hear, not an expert, pretty well. In southern Italy, not so well. And so there was this idea of social capital explaining the difference. And then Putnam started to focus a lot of attention on American society. So first, when I talk about social capital, I want to talk about two types of social capital. And there is a type of what he calls bonding social capital and what's called bridging social capital. And bonding social capital could be the extent that one is in interacting with people who are like oneself. And so I could, hang out with some other people who are like me, meaning they're white, meaning they're male, maybe they're approximately my age, maybe they're approximately my education, approximately my income. And these could be people in the community in which I live, the town in which I live. It could be, part of a church that I go to, or a synagogue that I go to. Could be a sports club, could be just a social club I go to, and we just kind of go there and hang out and talk to each other. And so he'll also say, you know, that I'm kind of building some capital with these people to work on problems in my community. So again, let's say we're talking my town, and let's say there's some problems, you know, some environmental issues or some waste removal issues, and I might, you know, be with these people, and we have a problem in town, so I'm more willing to work with them. I trust them, I respect them. You know, maybe they have some different ideas. I listen to their different ideas, and you know, we solve the problem. Again, it could be we need better schools, or we need some new roads or something like that. And you know, just because I spend these time with them, I trust them, and even though they may have some differences, you know, with me, we're still able to kind of resolve them, and I respect the differences, and because I respect them. So if they offer a different opinion, saying, well, maybe we don't need to spend that much money, and I want to spend $1 gazillion on it, and they said that, well, you know, I'm willing to listen, and we'll kind of work something out. I don't start off with a high level of distrust of them. Unlike if, you know, these were people who I never met with before. And even just the fact that I know these people and spend some time with these people, maybe I'm more willing to come to a meeting with these people and just talk to these people, and we're going to kind of work together on it. Okay, because we have some trust too. I think building trust in the spirit of collaboration is the key thing. Now, that's called a bonding, and he's called that a bonding because I'm spending time with people who are like me, and so I'm bonding with them. There's another type of social capital that he refers to as a bridging social capital. So one thing that we'll see not lately, soon, is that in the United States, but by the measures of social capital was high in the United States in the 1950s, and then when we get to the 1960s and 70s, it actually starts to go down. Well, you know, some people would say, well, yeah, you know, there's this kind of high levels of sort of social activity, and people are kind of civically engaged. You know, they'll come out and they'll work on problems. But and maybe that was good, you know, maybe that's high in the 1950s, but at the same time, you know, the 1950s were not a very good period for race relations, and so that's, you know, really kind of poor. So how can people say, well, how can you talk about there being you know, good social capital in the 1950s when race relations were not that good? Okay, and like I said, you know, race, you know, social capital started to decline in the United States by his measures in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I would say, actually, and I think a lot of other people would say that race relations actually began to improve in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And so how does that make sense? Well, what he talks about is, okay, there is this kind of bonding social capital, and that's kind of, you know, people being together with people who are like them, and they can still work together to solve problems in their community. Okay, now the bridging social capital is kind of then connecting and establishing trust by spending time with people who are different from oneself. So he acknowledges that in the 1950s, you know, race relations in the United States were not all that great, and he would say too, you know, of course, it's not all that great because white people and Black people are not spending much time with each other. And later on, there began to be a little bit more integration than there had been previously, for sure. Not a perfect world by any means. And so he talks about bridging capital. And again, that refers to making some connections with people who are different from oneself. So that's the key thing, and I hope you get the idea. Now I'm going to share my screen with you, and hopefully you can see this here. And you know, he'll talk about this social capital as building up norms of reciprocity, you know, tolerance for diversity, feelings of trust and safety, feelings of citizen power and proactivity. If people feel they can work together and get something done, they can be efficacious, as we might say, they can accomplish things. And again, there's these ideas of different types of social capital. There's the bonding versus the bridging. So he has that idea, people can form networks. He would argue that when you have high levels of social capital, people have a positive outlook in life, and that isolationism actually results in a negative outlook in life, and that people with high social capital have values of respect for others, tolerance of others' points of views. They have norms of trust that they follow, and that these are obviously very, very important things. Maybe I should change my, is that better? I think that probably is better. So of my PowerPoint, okay. So those are the things that lead to good social capital. So as I mentioned last time, Putnam, a famous book by him is called Bowling Alone. And what he talks about is the rise and decline of bowling leagues. And so on this chart, which I hope you can see, it has data there recording the rise and decline of bowling leagues. And, you can see that bowling leagues kind of peak in the 1960s and then start to go down. Okay, he has it differentially for men and women. I guess with the assumption that, and probably supported, I'm guessing that men are more likely to bowl than women, though there are, of course, some female bowlers out there, but you can see, it rises and declines. And again, it's not simply about bowling as opposed to leagues. And so what he argues, you join a bowling league. Truth be told, when I was a young person, I was in a bowling league. I'm not sure how well his explanation would apply, but in a sense that it certainly wasn't much bridging. Most of the people who I was bowling with were just like me. They were from the same neighborhood where I lived in. So that usually is going to generate a lot of similarity within the group, but you still see the rise and fall. And again, the idea with leagues is that it brings one in contact with others. Okay, now this also, now you could say, well, bowling leagues are one thing, but not everybody's part of a bowling league. And so there's all other types of ways that we could be with other people. Okay, and so he has looked at a large number of different types of associations and organizations that are out there in American life. And they all basically do follow the same pattern, more or less, of the bowling leagues, which you can see here again is it peaking around 1960 and then starting to go down afterwards. So it's not bowling and only bowling. And again, he looks at bowling, but he also looks at church attendance, synagogue attendance, membership in bridge clubs and social organizations like the Kiwanis clubs, the Knights of Columbus, the Royal Order of the Moose, and all these other types of things that people might do where they are with other people. And he notes this decline occurring. Okay. And again, what he thinks this all means is that we do not work as well together. And there has been, declines in social trust, and certainly this period here also, maybe one of the worst things happening is an increase in the crime rate, in the United States. And you could say what's happening with an increase in the crime rate is a lack of empathy for other people, that people are doing some hurtful things, to others out there in the world. And so that's pretty bad. Now, let's say, you kind of all buy into this. You can Google him and get more information. You can read his book, which is, one of those doorstopper type books. That's a very accessible book. It's made for a lay audience. He writes a lot of books on, he's a political scientist, but they're fairly accessible. Anyway, my thing I want to move to next is talking about why did this occur? So we have this decline occurring with people not spending as much time with other people. Okay. And so a question is why? And so let me talk about a couple of things that he rejected. Okay. So, or reject is maybe too strong. He maybe either rejected or he found them to be playing a relatively minor role in the decline of social capital. And so one of the things that changed in American, life, in this period of the 1960s and 1970s is women beginning to work outside the home more. And so you really have that occurring a lot in the 1960s and 70s. And oh God, I hope I was muted before. So I see I'm not now muted. I'm going to share my screen again. And you see the rise in social capital. Okay, and then it's decline. So I think the last point I was making was on women working outside the home, and maybe by women beginning to work outside the home, they were not doing as much in their homes, or now they're more pressed for time. They're doing what's called the double shift. They go to work, then they come home and they got to cook, clean, take care of the children and all of that, and leaves no time for anything else, and sort of it's sucking up, the family's time because they're working outside of the home. Not he would not say, that was a bad thing necessarily, but it has, some consequences for allocation of time. He finds that to be relatively minor thing in terms of affecting social capital. Another thing he looks at is commuting. So in the 1950s and 60s, there was the increase in the number of people living in suburbs. And so he wonders if, that spending that time commuting takes away from other things that people were doing. And so he argues that no, it didn't do that. He also argues, that there actually were some things in home life that made life easier. So, you have modern conveniences like microwaves and TV dinners, and you can buy more foods that is prepared foods, and dishwashers, and actually there are a lot of conveniences for home life that actually kind of freed up some time. You also have people having fewer children, and so children certainly take up time for people, and they start to have fewer children. Of course, that's one of the reasons women were able to enter the workforce, is they were able to control when and how many children they would have. So then there's kind of two things, and maybe, this ends in like 1998, 97, a third thing that maybe has also been kind of key. So one thing that he said also occurred at this time that maybe that did, so one thing that did reduce people spending time with other people outside the home is television. So television really starts to emerge in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And, if I had a graph, I'd show you, how it. Okay, so I think I just lost it. Now I rejoined again. So you see my screen again. I hope you see my screen again. And television is one of the factors that he cites for contributing to the decline in social capital in the United States. As people spent more time watching television, they spent less time with other people. And so one of the, kind of jokes I've heard people picked up again, I had to unmute. And hopefully you're seeing this. One of the things that he said he saw, I'm trying to, is that people were spending more time watching television. And the joke I was about to make was that they were watching Friends rather than being with friends. And so that does seem to be a factor. I will say his research did not extend really into the internet age and what impact the internet had on people's sociableness, if you will, and social capital. And so while I'm on electronic devices, I kind of want to mention that, and it's kind of interesting, and I think it's all speculative. On the one hand, people obviously spend more time on the internet, and one of the things, of course, they do on the internet is they're part of social media. They're on Facebook or Instagram or other types of social media, and it could be interacting with other people. And so he doesn't really talk about that. The really big emergence of social media occurred before he did his study. I know, though, from other things that I've read, that he acknowledges the presence of social media, probably really unsure about how social media does in terms of instilling social capital. On the one hand, it does bring people into contact with other people. And they can get together and probably, during the pandemic, it's probably been a big source for a big resource for people wanting to get together with other people and fill their social needs. On the other hand, I think there's reason to be skeptical that spending time with other people on social media is the same as spending time with people when you are face-to-face with them in their physical presence. When we're face-to-face, we kind of can get more of a sense for another person, kind of, again, feel for them, kind of sense about who they are, what they're like, whether we like them or not. We get verbal cues, the tone of voice that they have, how they speak. We get their facial cues, body language, all kind of vibes from them that we don't get when we're reading some text that they have perhaps put up. And probably, again, face to face, you kind of maybe get to feel more deeper for them and not the facades. Okay, so that's part of what he says has contributed to the decline in social capital. What he also says was important is this generation here, this what he calls this generation, we've talked about it before when we were talking about voting behavior, the World War II generation, called by Tom Brokaw the greatest generation, that this group of people here who were very participatory in World War II. Again, 80% of the men between 18 and 44 served in the military during World War II. Women who did not serve in the military, and that would be most women, still did a lot to support the war effort. They made sacrifices and did other types of things. And he said this group was just a very participatory, socially involved group of people. And then, of course, what we start to get later on is this group of people kind of dying off. And so what he argues is that it's what we call a generational change, generational replacement occurring, that this World War II generation is leaving, and the new generation, the baby boomers and all the generations Z, X, and Y, or whatever that follow, are not as participatory. Now, maybe again, this World War II generation is really the exception in American history and throughout the world. But anyway, that's what he says happened, and that it has deleterious effects for our society. And I think it's a really, really interesting idea. And I mean, you do find people who are in social groups and that have social memberships in lots of groups, very community involved, very tolerant, and with a lot of empathy and respect for other people in their world. Okay, now I'm going to make kind of a sort of radical shift, if you will. I'm talking about social capital, which is a great thing. Of course, it's kind of a bad thing that we perhaps have less of it, to talk about political violence. And I'll tell you, I've always in this course made a little bit of reference to political violence, but never as much as I'm about to do. And there's just some things that have been happening in American society that are very concerning in terms of political violence. Now, having said that, I'll also say that it's not as if there's never been political violence in American history. In fact, it's occurred many times, and maybe it's just kind of striking when it does. It's not the common thing, but we certainly have had a bit of it lately. I guess I'm not really want to say more of it. Certainly, the January 6th attack on the Capitol was in my mind, as you all know, very, very disturbing and very alarming. And we have these affiliative groups like the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, Three Percenters, and there's probably some other ones out there that I don't know about or I'm unaware of that also, say they are willing to be violent to attain their own political goals. I mean, we've had other groups that were political and violent in our history. The Ku Klux Klan being maybe the most prominent, well-known, long-lasting group promoting and practicing political violence in the United States. We have also had, there have been, you might say, groups responding to them. One that comes to my mind is the Black Panthers in the 1960s and 1970s, who were, I'm not sure they actually practiced that much political violence. It says they were willing to practice political violence. I'm not expanding the screen because it seemed that I ran into problems when I was doing that. Okay. But let me, say, I mean, political violence is a way of political participation. So that's why I'm including it here. At the same time, political violence is extremely disruptive. So if everything is really functioning well in our society, we would not have political violence. And probably, again, you'd have some violence occurring because of mentally disturbed individuals. And so that would occur. And I could imagine a world where the political system was actually functioning perfectly. You still had some mentally disturbed individuals who were practicing violence. But to the extent we start having groups and larger scale amounts of violence, that is really, really disturbing. And so I think we're in a period that I find very disturbing because of the amount of political violence that is occurring. Again, what we want in a political system is the peaceful resolution of conflict. Violence has been part of American history. So the United States was founded on a revolution that was violent, and the United States was a colony of Britain, and the colonists wanted to break away from Britain and be independent, and they did so. They did so through war. So we also, kind of glorify that kind of violence in our founding, and it's part of our creation story, if you will. And there are places like Washington's Crossing in Pennsylvania and Valley Forge in Pennsylvania, and Lexington and Concord and in Massachusetts that are of historical significance because they were sites of wars, and they're part, again, of our creation. And there are leaders of that revolutionary war that are we study in school. There are movies like Patriots, the Patriot with Mel Gibson, that glorifies the violence of the Revolutionary War. So it's part of our founding. Also part of our founding is the war against the Indians, and that was part of our founding. The expansion of the Europeans to the western part of the United States, and the confrontations between American Indians and the Europeans. And so, I mean, there was violence that occurred. It's kind of interesting to think about the first chapter of the Spitzer book, where he also talks about, that we've kind of romanticized it, and the violence wasn't, quite as much in that Wild West as people think that it was. But nevertheless, my kind of point is that it is violence is part of American history, and to some extent we romanticize it. There's a number of other famous violent occurrences in the United States. So one of the most, and here I'm talking about domestic violence, so I'm leaving out something like September 11th, because that was by foreign terrorists against the United States, and really focusing on violence by one American against another American. So a famous one was the Oklahoma City bombing, where a couple of fellows built a bomb on a truck using fertilizer, blew it up in Oklahoma City next to a federal government building, killing over 160 people. So that was a violent act. There have periodically been race riots in the United States in the 1960s, in Rochester, actually in 1964, I believe. Famous one is in Detroit in 1968. One's in Washington, D.C. after Martin Luther King was killed in 1968. After the announcement of the Rodney King verdict in 1991, in Los Angeles, there were riots. So those were kind of uprising. There's also a famous one called the Tulsa Massacre, which also occurred in Oklahoma, which was a large group of white citizens going into a part of Tulsa that was actually very economically successful, and basically torching the place. And of course, as many of you know, there's been lynchings occurring in the United States that where whites killed Black people because in some cases they thought they were in violation of some norms, or they were simply trying to let them know that they were the subordinate parts of the population. There's been conflicts between police and unionists in the United States, not really in recent times, or none that come to mind, but when the union movement was, gathering steam in the United States, there sometimes were violent confrontations between the police and the union members. In the 1960s and 1970s, excuse me, there were also anti-war protests that occurred, that in some cases were violent. There were buildings that were bombed. Some of the anti-war protesters, really a small group of the anti-war protesters. The most famous group was a group called the Weathermen, who were, about supported violence. And unfortunately, a number of them, I guess for better or for worse, maybe unfortunately is not the right word, didn't know what they were doing and sometimes blew themselves up. And there are a couple of cases actually where they did kill other people. And again, it was politically motivated violence. A lot of the violence that has occurred in American history is tied to race. Not all of it, but a lot of it, probably most of it. In the current period, we do have people like the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the 3%ers. This group out there, they were prominent in the attack on the Capitol on January 6th in 2020, trying to prevent Joe Biden from becoming president of the United States. They tend to draw people who are, have some military experience. They tend to be more prominent in rural areas of the United States. They certainly are disproportionately white and male, and kind of have a very militaristic orientation. A recent example of a group that was, in this case, potentially violent. They were threatening violence. They were stopped. These are the folks who wanted to capture, kidnap the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, and then hold her on trial for breaking laws in the United States and violating the Constitution. The FBI but they got tipped off about this plot, and they kind of watched them for a while, and before they could do anything serious, or by the time they had enough information, they arrested these really brilliant young men, and they go on trial, and then they get to go to jail there. So I mean, it's clearly part of violence in our current period. Political violence in the United States has occurred for a number of reasons or with a number of motivations. Sometimes the violence was to exert control over a subordinate population. So, for example, race being the most common. I guess you could say it's happened too when unions were forming and there was violence against those unionists. Let me see. Probably another case I would think about is in Chicago at the 1968 Democratic Convention, when the Chicago police used very aggressive force against young people demonstrating against the Democratic Party and the United States involvement in the Vietnam War at that time. They were really, exercising control over subordinate population. Violence has also been used, though, to defy authorities. So, there are cases where groups that, I would say are kind of minority groups. And I don't mean that only in a racial sense, but also in a racial sense, but as well as other types of, groups that were in a minority, they rose up and they used violence. So race riots in the United States, Rodney King riots in the United States. I will say that usually public opinion turns against those who commit political violence. And, one of the interesting things about Martin Luther King is that when he was recruiting people to be in demonstrations in the South, one of the things that he told them is, you might be attacked physically, and what we want you to do is to not respond. And so you have to receive the violence. You do not respond violently to the violence that is visited upon you. And he quite brilliantly, understood that public opinion would turn against those who use the violence. And so when there would be cases of people demonstrating in the South against segregation and the fact that many Black people, for a variety of reasons, couldn't vote, he was gaining the moral high ground by not being seen as a perpetrator of violence. Polls show in recent years, just the past 3 or 4, that you see people of both political parties express violent tendencies and express support for violence. And there's certainly, I might have thought at first, or I did think at first, that you might see more support for it among Republicans than among Democrats. But actually, you see about equal amounts from Democrats and Republicans. Now, it is for different reasons. The Republicans who support, the use of violence usually want to maintain the current social order, the old social order, and the maintenance of being in a dominant position for those groups, whites, men, those with more money, Christian. Democratic groups usually want change, and so they're kind of more likely to be supporting violence for those to bring about change. One of the things that we see in those people who are more willing to support violence is that they often have no empathy for their opponents, and they often kind of view their opponents as less than human. And, if you see them as less than human, as not really deserving very much, then it's much easier to wish violence upon them. So that's striking. You also see more support for people who have greater tendencies towards physical aggressiveness. So, there are some people, just by the nature of their personality, that are very unlikely to be violent and are very unlikely to be physically aggressive with other people. And on the other hand, some people who are easily physically aggressive, doesn't maybe take much to kind of push them in a direction of being very violent physically. So that's a key thing, also shaping who's likely to support violence and practice violence. It's just their own personality traits. Democracy, as I said before, is for losers. Democracy, you have to accept that sometimes you will lose. You'll probably, at best, lose as much as you win, and maybe you'll even lose more. But what we need in democracy is that people are going to accept that. Did you know? We're going to make decisions on the basis of majority rule, and sometimes they're not going to win. And so that means somebody else is going to go into a position of power. And so they have to accept that and not become violent as a result. One other thing we have in our current period that is I think, kind of problematic is a lot of their identities all line up in the same direction. So what I mean by that is people's racial identity, people's religious identity, people's identity of residence, whether they see themselves as a city person or a rural person. A lot of those things all seem to go together politically. So for example, for Republicans, it's primarily white. It's many people from rural areas, many of them who identify as Christian or religious. And so the groups that they feel, that they're part of and they identify with are all on the same side politically in terms of being Republican. And of course, it's the same for Democrats, the people of color, people who live in urban areas, disproportionately women. And so all of these things kind of lining up. So we all have a tendency sometimes, not sometimes, but they have often a lot of dislike for those in out groups. And so not only is the out group kind of people who are Republican for a Democrat, but also they are people who tend to be white and people who tend to be more likely to be male, more likely to live in rural areas. And so they don't feel part of them and have greater negativity towards them. So that also contributes mightily to the increasing political violence that we have. I will say too, it's very well established in lots of research that people have negativity towards outgroups and a bias in favor of the in-groups, meaning the groups that they're part of. It's probably rooted in our DNA and in sort of the biases that we have towards our own family. Sometimes these biases are very shallow, and sometimes they can be just kind of meaningless, really, and even kind of fun. So kind of sports, are kind of one of those parts of our life where, it's actually okay. You got your team, the team that you're part of, you identify with, and to favor them and want them to win and want them to do well. And you want them to do well at the expense of someone else. And that's okay, as long as you take it that it's basically just entertainment. It's just kind of fun. But we have a bias, towards our group. And a hostility, negativity, maybe towards the out group. And so when we look at a football game and we see the call by the ref, and if it's against, the Bills, think maybe the Bills are getting screwed over and, it's not really fair. And the same call could go, in favor of the Bills, and we think it's right and appropriate. One of the things I will say, though, is kind of really, has been kind of disturbing in the current period is Trump kind of to some extent encouraging violence. And so I see that certainly as very, problematic because he's a leader. Another part of that too is also other commentators out there in the world that demonize the other side and see the other side as almost inhuman, as incompetent, as immoral. So if you watch some of the people on some of the networks, and they'll talk about, Democrats or talk about Republicans, they refer to them as just morally wrong or incredibly idiotic and wanting to run the country into ruin. And so, then it just kind of also, helps increase some support of many people for violence by seeing the other side so negatively. We also see that Republicans who hold misogynistic views, that is, views that are very negative towards women and have the greatest racial resentment, that is, the greatest resentment towards people of color among Republicans, tend to be the most supportive of violence. Now, what's kind of interesting is that for there are Democrats that have racial resentment, there are Democrats that have misogynistic views. There, the being misogynistic and being racially resentful actually tends to temper down violence. And for Democrats, for Republicans, when they think, well, you know, they're negative towards women, they're negative towards people of color, and of course, people of color and women tend to be disproportionately Democrats. So those are three things then: Democrat, women, people of color, that are all kind of lining up the same. And so there's greater expression of support for violence against the other party. For Democrats, it just doesn't work that way. And again, overall, Democrats are likely to also support violence. Okay, so I have reached a point for this talk, and I'm going to end, and I'm going to pray. I'm going to stop my screen sharing, and you get to see me in my office there for whatever that's worth. And I'm going to pray to the Lord Almighty that this works. If not, I'll be doing it again this evening. And I'll see you Monday.